Olá e bem-vindos ao Low Key Portuguese. Hello and welcome to Low Key Portuguese. Today we're going to look at reflexive pronouns and how they interact with specific verbs or with certain verbs that, like the name implies, reflect the action of the subject back unto themselves. And that's essentially what a reflexive verb and what reflexive pronouns do. They reflect the action of a subject onto themselves. Okay, so these occur in English. They're not exclusive to Portuguese. In English, we tend to use the pronouns myself, yourself, herself, himself, itself, ourselves, or themselves to address these ideas of actions being reflected back onto a subject. So when I say something like, he convinced himself, that's an example of an action being reflected back onto the subject of the action. So not only is he the subject of that sentence, himself is also the recipient of that action, thus the reflexive pronoun himself. So in Portuguese, these occur in a slightly different way. There are specific pronouns that go along with each of the different subject perspectives, in the same way that we look at subject pronouns: eu, tu, ele, ela, você, nós, eles, elas, e vocês. There's going to be equivalencies that we can establish between those subject pronouns and our reflexive pronouns. So when we first started, I'm going to assume that most of you have heard the verb chamar, right? Namely, at the very beginning when you're learning Portuguese, you probably learned the phrase como te chamas, right? What's your name? Really what we're saying with that question is, what do you call yourself, right? The verb chamar is to call or to name. Most ways we would translate that statement would be to think of it as, what do you call yourself? But we don't speak that way in English. We just say, what's your name, right? So it's just important to understand that these reflexive pronouns are going to work with the same verbs that you've been working with up to this point. AR, ER, IR verbs, all verbs, but it's mostly going to be used with the verbs that the actions make sense that they would reflect back onto a subject. So it's not every verb that it makes sense to use these reflexive pronouns with, but there are definitely some verbs that will require that to use this concept. So let's look at the different pronouns that go along with each of the different subject pronouns, the reflexive pronouns that are kind of their counterpart, the reflexive counterparts of the subject pronoun. So with eu, the reflexive pronoun that you typically will see is me. Now it's kind of an easy one. Me. So it's our first person reflexive pronoun, me. So with the verb chamar, eu, I, chamo-me, call myself, Sérgio. So eu chamo-me Sérgio. But if I ask you, what's your name? Como te chamas? Or chamas-te, and then whatever your name might be. We'll talk more about pronoun placement in just a little bit because there are some rules that will change where that pronoun will be placed within a given sentence. And there are some triggers that will force that shift. So that's a little bit later on in this video. With ele, ela, and você, so our third person perspective, ele and ela, the subject pronoun is ele and ela, or are ele and ela, and then our reflexive pronoun is going to be se. And just like with our other verb conjugations, você, our formal you, will also be using the same reflexive pronoun. So it's going to be streamlined in that sense that what we do with subject pronouns when we conjugate verbs and apply the different endings, we're going to do that the same way because we have to conjugate the verb still. And we're going to apply this same reflexive pronoun for ele, ela, and você. How do we know which one is which? Context. That's always going to be the case, right? Context will dictate what that se is representing, what that se is replacing as an antecedent. When we get to our first person plural, our we, ourselves, it's very similar to nós, but we remove the accent. It's pronounced nos. So nós, we, nos, ourselves. Okay? Depois, we're going to look at the same groupings that we've been seeing for subject pronouns and for verb conjugation altogether. Eles, masculine mixed group they, elas, female group they, and then you plural, vocês. They're also going to use se. So really, for reflexive pronouns, there are four pronouns you need to think about. Me, te, se, and nos. And anything that's third person, ele, ela, or eles and elas, the plural forms of those groupings, you're going to go with se. And then our você, our formal you, as well as our plural you, vocês, those are also going to be using the se reflexive pronoun. Okay, simple enough, right? All right, so where do we put the reflexive pronoun? There are a number of rules that we want to factor in when it comes to reflexive pronoun placement. It can get a little bit confusing, but there are some rules that you can think about here that just might make it a little bit simpler. Really, it's usage, right? It's through usage, immersion, and practice that we really start to develop an understanding and internalize these concepts. So practice, listen to whatever you possibly can, interact, whether that's with somebody in conversation or you have the internet, you have YouTube, you have lots of different resources in which you can interact with Portuguese. So you make sure you use them. So where do we put these reflexive pronouns? The first rule is with negating statements. So really anytime you're going to use any of the negating words like não, no, nunca, never, nada, nothing, or ninguém, nobody, we're going to shift that pronoun placement from, I should say, the hyphenated pronoun. That pronoun's now going to come before. So in an example like não me lembro, I don't remember. Now, in English, this doesn't translate, right? We don't say I don't remind myself, but it's an action that we're doing to ourselves, right? Remembering, right? We're doing that. We're the subject, and we're using our brains to reflect on something that's happened in the past that we experience or that we're aware of, but it's happening to us. So conceptually, we're still reflecting that action onto ourselves. But if I say I remember, I'm going to use the hyphen M-E, right? Lembro-me. So I remember, lembro-me disso, I remember that, lembro-me dele, I remember him. But if I use that word não, that hyphenated pronoun is now going to come before. Without the hyphen, it's going to become não me lembro. Não me lembro. If I ask you, don't you remember? Não te lembras. Don't you remember? Não te lembras. Ah, sim. Lembras-te. Yes, you do remember. Lembras-te. So the affirmative hyphen pronoun, if it's a negating, that pronoun's going to come before, and you're going to remove that hyphen. There's no hyphen there. So that's just one example. There are many examples we can get into, but for the sake of brevity, let's move on to the next rule, and that is when the reflexive verb, whether it's, necessary pronoun, is going to follow an adverb, and that includes interrogative adverbs as well as interrogative pronouns, which essentially are our question words, okay? So again, back to our example from the beginning. What's your name? Como te chamas? That's why that te comes before, right? We probably thought about that. Well, I thought these things came after. In our very first example, it's como te chamas. What's your name, or how are you called, or how do you call yourself? What do you call yourself? Como te chamas. But if I want to say, oh yeah, you're João. Chamas-te João. There's no negating word. I'm affirming the statement, right? I'm making an affirmative statement. You are called. You call yourself João. Chamas-te João. Okay? That's really it. So first of all, if there's a negating word, if there's an interrogative adverb or interrogative pronoun, again, our question words, that's our second rule. Third rule is if it follows an indefinite pronoun or a relative pronoun. And these are things like every, any, each, certain, many, and so on. There's a host of these, and it's an important thing, an important list to kind of internalize, but we can talk about that in a different video. Actually, I have a video on indefinites that I can point to. I'll probably put some sort of card somewhere here for you guys to click on. But there is a video that does a touch upon those. So once you internalize those and remember those, anytime you use them within the statement. So remember, when I say within a statement, that's not necessarily within the sentence. It's within like the certain clause in the sentence. So if it's a very lengthy sentence, it's really in that clause or in that phrasing in which you're using one of these words. Again, negating words, interrogative adverbs or our question words, or indefinite pronouns or relative pronouns like we'll see here. So in an example like todos se queixam do problema. Everybody complains about the problem. Everybody complains. If I'm using everybody, that's going to trigger todos, or all. There's another way of thinking about that. all are complaining about the problem. So that will trigger that the se that would go with they, right? Everyone, eles, elas, se queixam do problema. Todos se queixam do problema. Okay, so there's, again, it's a very specific example. We can talk about many more. If you have any questions, by all means, hit me up in the comments and I'll address them. I'll make more videos if this is something that's interesting to you and you're still not quite understanding. But I figured I'd put something out there to help you get started thinking about reflexive pronouns. So, next rule that we want to think about here is when the reflexive verb follows a subordinating conjunction. That's going to be que, which you're probably already thinking about que as a question word, so that's probably already going to trigger where you're going to place the pronoun at that point. Se, if, como, but in this case, when we're thinking about como, not as how, but as or like, and then porque, because. So anytime we're using any of these, what they're called subordinating conjunctions, for the grammatically inclined, but just think that, if, as, like, because. But in Portuguese, que, that, se, if, como, like or as, and porque, because. Okay? So here's an example, and it's a nice expression that I got to give thanks to one of my students, Greg, who asked me about this specific question, or about this specific phrasing, and if he was taught this incorrectly by one of his previous instructors or somebody that he'd spoken with. And the expression is, if I recall correctly, if I want to use that expression, if I recall correctly, again, in English, it's that idea again of remembering, right, to myself, the subject thinking to themselves, recalling. But here we're going to think of it as reminding myself, remembering to myself. So the pronoun we're going to use is the me, because I'm talking about me. Se, if, bem, in this case it's well or good, if I recall the correctly in the translation, and lembro is the I remember. So se bem me lembro, if I recall correctly, because that se is being used, that me is going to come before the verb, in this case lembro. But if I want to say, oh, I remember from our previous statement before, previous example earlier on, lembro me. But if I use that se, if I recall correctly, se bem me lembro, now it's going to come prior, it's going to precede that verb, that conjugated verb. It's the important thing to think about too. Yes, they can be used, these reflexive pronouns can be used with infinitives, just verbs that are conceptual. But we do, if we have a subject, you're going to have to use that, reflexive pronoun in accordance with the subject, but that verb's also going to have to be conjugated. That ending of that verb is going to have to reflect who's doing the action. Pronto, é tudo por hoje. That's everything for today in this video. If you're interested in more, please hit me up. Send me a comment. Let me know what you're interested in, what topics you'd like to learn more about, and I will gladly put them out there for you. I'm just trying to make Portuguese a more palatable language. I recognize how difficult it is for foreigners to really get a handle on the language. There's lots of resources out there, lots of people teaching, but I figured I'd add my 2 cents into the mix, and hopefully this works out for somebody. Just another thing is that I have some courses going 3 times a year. We have 3 trimesters, and this is through an institute in California at Sausalito. You can check out their website. You can sign up for group classes. They generally run on Sundays. In the Pacific time zone, it's from 9 to 7. Different sections depending on your level. And I also offer one-to-one classes if you're interested through my website, lowkeyportuguese.com. I hope this is helpful to you. You can also join our Patreon where you get some free goodies every month. There's a little welcoming gift for anybody that decides to throw us a pastel de nata and a café. And that's it for today. I hope this is helpful. E até a próxima. Ciao.